Good morning, everyone. My name is Jianyu Yuan. I am the chair of the History Committee of SIOP. On behalf of the History Committee, I would like to welcome you to the SIOP 2024 Living History Interview Series. So this series was the brainchild of Dr. Paul Levy and Dr. David Baker. It was originally launched in 2013, and for each session, we usually interview a prominent IO psychologist, followed by a Q&A session. These interviews are conducted every year at the SIOP annual conference, and you can find the recordings of past interviews in the SIOP Living History playlist on YouTube. So for this year's interview, we were unable to conduct it at the annual conference in Chicago. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Virginia Schein for agreeing to do this over this format. And I would also like to thank Dr. Milt Hackle as well as our amazing support staff from SIOP for helping us make this happen over a Zoom webinar. So for today's session, towards the end, we're going to have time to take your questions. You can, as Jen just said, you can put your questions in the Q&A. All right. So for Dr. Virginia Schein is a leading work and organizational psychologist with over 50 years of experience as a professor, consultant, manager, and advocate for social and economic justice in the workplace. She received her PhD in psychology from NYU. She has been a professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, Brooke College of the City University of New York, Case Western Reserve University, Yale University, and Gettysburg College. She was also director of personnel research for MetLife in New York City. Dr. Schein is internationally recognized as a leading researcher on women in management. She identified the think manager, think male phenomena as a major barrier to women's advancement in management in 1973. Her widely cited research spans 4 decades and 5 continents. She is a fellow of SIOP and the International Association of Applied Psychology and a founding member of Mayflower Group and Global Organization for Humanitarian Work Psychology. She's the past president of the Work and Organizational Psychology Division of IAAP. So to quote one of our past SIOP presidents, Dr. Steve Rogelberg, who interviewed Dr. Schein, so Virginia has been in practice, she's been in science, she's been in academics. She's the perfect model for a science practitioner that we advocate at SIOP, and her research has been truly transformative for our field. So once again, I would like to thank Dr. Schein for agreeing to do this interview for us, and I'm sure the audience will learn a great deal from your amazing career. So getting into today's interview, the first question I have for you, Dr. Schein, is what inspired you to pursue IO psychology as a career?
Yes, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Jianyu and the Living History Committee for inviting me here. And thank you just all very much. I am delighted to be here. How did I get started is the initial question. Did my undergraduate work at Cornell University. And I went to Cornell. I was going to be an English major, and I was going to eventually be a journalist and the editor of my own newspaper. Well, that didn't go. I didn't go in that direction. While I was at Cornell, I took Psych 101. That didn't do much for me. But for some reason, I took the second course in psychology, perception. And that's when it all came together. What fascinated me about this particular field was you could ask a question, and then through something called the scientific method, whatever that was, you could actually get an answer. So you had control groups and experimental groups. You asked the question, you did the research, you got the answer. I was hooked. I thought, this is really cool stuff. So then I continued on in psychology. Cornell was very experimental in its base. So I took learning and I took motivation and all those courses. And so I was still intrigued. But when I realized I wanted to be a psychologist, I thought, yeah, but I don't want to be a rat psychologist, and I don't want to be a clinical psychologist, which they didn't really teach anyway. I don't want to be in a lab. I wanted to be where the action was. And fortunately for me, they had industrial psychology, and I was extremely fortunate. Patricia Kane-Smith was a leading professor there, and she taught this course. Tom Ryan, who was also an early leading figure in industrial psychology, studying motivation, was there as well. So I lucked out. I said, now this is what I want to do. I can do this kind of research, but it's about people who work. And as a 19-year-old, I said, wow, everybody works. This is going to be fantastic. So I just decided this is what I want to do. And I went full steam ahead. So after I graduated from Cornell, I went to NYU to do my doctoral work. And I do remember, in terms of Cornell, when I got there, I was talking to my fellow students, and they all had been interviewed, and nobody had called me to New York to be interviewed. So I asked one of the professors, and I said, how come I didn't get an interview? And they just said, if you're good enough for Pat Smith, you're good enough for us. So I felt very good about the prior experience and the current experience. And it was a terrific department at NYU. Ray Katzel was the chairman. Abe Corman had just started out. He was a brand new assistant professor. Bob Ewan was there. Joe Weitz, who is no longer with us, was a key figure. He was in industrial, but he was in experimental psychology. I was his research assistant, as well as I was a research assistant for Jack Cohn, well known in stat. So I really enjoyed my undergraduate experience and then my graduate experience in industrial. And I received my PhD in 1969 from NYU. One small point here, I was, it turns out, the first woman to get my PhD in industrial psychology from NYU. But interestingly enough, at the time, nobody even mentioned it. It wasn't anything, to be honest. It wasn't until around the mid-'80s that I started to be introduced with that addition to my background. So that's how I got into the field, and I've never looked back.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's amazing how your interest in the perception also connects with your later research areas. So the second question, so you started your career as a practitioner. What was the motivation or the reason for that decision? And can you also share with us what were those early years in industry like? And when you reflect back, what are the accomplishments that you're most proud of?
Thank you. Yes. Well, I wanted to be a practitioner for two reasons. One, maybe less relevant, but there I was around 1969. Yeah, I think I was 25 years old. And what I thought was, I have never worked. How in the world am I going to go teach somebody about people who work and working life when all I've ever had were summer jobs? So that was one reason. But the second and the real reason was just something in me. I wanted to be where the action was. I just wanted to be out there in the companies with the people. So that's why all I wanted to do was be a practitioner. My 3 jobs in industry were all in New York. And it was an exciting time. And I think, so I'd like to comment on those times, because I think they were different then, as a living history person, than they are now. We were a small group of called industrial psychologists. I was initially with an association, then with a company. Most of the industrial psychologists at the time were in-house psychologists. So nothing was outsourced. What you did for your company as an industrial psychologist. There were the IO kind of consulting firms that we have now simply did not exist. There were some consulting firms, but they were not dominated by IO. So it was the in-house psychologist that was prominent. We were all in New York. We thought of ourselves, I think, sort of as pioneers, because now where are we? We're in 1970, 1971, 72, for us, the early days. It was still difficult to convince management that we had something really important to offer, to implement some of the programs that we thought were essential. It was always an uphill battle. So when we were able to achieve something, we really felt very good, again, as I said, as pioneers. And we were a fairly, close group. One thing that got started was Metro. It was Bill Byam, Mort Spitzer, also Tread Parker, who... It was an organization dominated by clinical psychologists, and they kind of took it over and turned it into something for industrial psychology. So we were able to meet at Metro once a month, share stories and stuff. So we were friends, colleagues, all trying to get done what we thought was important. Now, my first job was at the American Management Association, so that was great. I mean, they did training for managers all over the country, and I just thought, yes, I want to be where the action is. And so I did training evaluation. All these jobs were in New York. And then my second job was with the Life Office Management Association, and we were responsible for research related to the home office people, not the salespeople, but the home office. My title then, I think, was Manager of Personnel Research. I was heavily involved in selection, involved in the burgeoning field of attitude surveys, and so on. I do remember it was a fascinating time in terms of equal employment opportunity. The court cases were just beginning to come down. And I remember Griggs versus Duke Power said, oh, lo and behold, for selection, it said tests have to be job related. Well, guess who knows about validity? So I spent a lot of my time giving lectures and explaining to managers what test validity really was. My third job was probably, for me, the best experience. I was still young, maybe about 30, 31. And I became director of personnel research for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which was at the time the largest insurance company in the United States. I had a staff of 5. This was fascinating to me when I look back. Their first head of EEO, Doris Parker, the first person to ever hold that position, reported to me. Fortunately, she knew her stuff, and she just went and did what was important that needed doing. But I think back, I think they probably didn't know what to do with the EEO function. So they said, oh, personnel research. We don't know quite what that is either. So we'll put them all together. And then another professional in charge of selection, and then 3 more master's level individuals. Great staff. Really enjoyed it. There, 2 accomplishments that stand out that things we were able to achieve. Now, say we're back in 73, 74. One was the introduction of flexible working hours. Now, look, everybody's working at home now. This is nothing. But let me tell you, in those days, if you weren't in the office, you weren't working. And then on top of that, if the idea that employees could have flexible hours, which would mean that sometimes their supervisors would not be there and they're still supposed to work. Well, MetLife, being a real big bureaucracy, the supervisors thought this company will go to hell in a handbasket if we do flexible working hours. So I was able to convince management that the best way to try and introduce this was through research. And we were able to do a 3-month experiment, which there I am in heaven doing this. These were all with the clerks, the people they thought who would be most disruptive. We had control groups and experimental groups measuring and all this was productivity. They didn't care about the attitudes, just productivity. So we had that. We measured productivity pre and post. We measured productivity over time. We measured productivity last year and this year, et cetera. So a variety of ways we could get our hands on productivity measures for these groups. And what I remember is it was done, and what do you know? Flexible working hours had no adverse effect on productivity. So I remember I wrote the memo, sent it through my bosses up to Dick Schein, the CEO of the company. And in less than a week, we got back through my bosses, the memo, which basically said, do it. So we were able to put 50,000 employees of MetLife on flexible working hours. We were the first company in New York City to do that. And I attribute that back to IO, that because of our ability to do research where we could get these fairly definitive answers, Dick Schein was able to say, do it. The other sort of outcome that I remember of that on an individual level, living in New York, I was on the subway going home, and there's this young man hanging on the strap in front of me, talking all about flexible working hours. I start to listen. And he says, yeah, I said, we just had a baby. And so because of this new procedures, I get to go home at 3 o'clock and play with my baby. And I sat there and I thought, so that's why I'm an industrial psychologist, really enjoyed the experience. The second accomplishment that comes to mind was attitude surveys and the Mayflower Group, which is still prominent today. So at the time, as I said, we just well, IBM was always doing surveys, but we just got management at MetLife and other places to accept the attitude survey process. But one of the key questions, of course, was we have no comparative data. How do we know what this means? No normative data. So, and I think it was thanks to IBM, I think Dick Dunnington there spearheaded the movement of let's all get together and use the same items. Wow, that was big. So what was happened, sort of like Noah's Ark, we were selected 2 from each industry. So it was MetLife and I think State Farm, General Motors and Ford, Xerox and IBM. So all the industrial psychologists from these particular companies, I think maybe 18 of us, I don't know, 12, we all went out, as I remember, to La Jolla, California, to come up with 20 items. Now, maybe as an indication of the experience, what I remember is it seemed to be a room with no windows. Now, maybe that's just how I felt, because there we were. Everybody's quantitatively oriented and saying, my item is better than your item. No, look at this data. But somehow or other, we came through and we came up with 20 items, which a couple years ago, I looked and I think the same 20 items are still there. So that I think was also a significant accomplishment during those days, which I say I really enjoyed those industry experiences as a practitioner that stayed with me my whole career.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Those are amazing examples. And I think they really speak to how we want to make positive changes with our science in the workplace. So next, transitioning into the academic part of your journey. So what was your inspiration for developing the Think Manager, Think Male paradigm, and how would you assess its impact on shaping both the science and the practice of gender equality?
Yes, thank you. Actually, just to minor correction, this was not done when I was in the academic community. This was done while I was in industry, and I sort of want to give a shout out to the support that I received in industry for doing this particular research. Now, how did it get started? I often say when I'm describing this, I got inspired because I got mad or I got angry about the situation. I was at Loma when I did this research. And, I would look around, I was a young manager and where are the women? And there weren't any women managers, say 71, 72. So before any research began, I just started informally asking the question of a lot of senior execs. How come there's no women managers? And I got one of 2 answers. One, they would say, well, women don't want these jobs. Okay. And the second answer they would always give, not that one, was, well, women aren't qualified for these jobs. And believe it or not, they said that with a straight face. Nobody blinked, nobody worried about saying an answer like that. But I received the answers and I thought, I don't think so. I think there's more to this picture than that. So that was kind of the impetus for the research. As I said earlier, I did this at Loma, and I'm very grateful to the support. My boss at Loma was Bob Dugan, and he was extremely supportive of this research. And also, while I was at Loma, we had a personnel research committee, which was that the industrial psychologists from all the leading insurance companies, State Farm, Allstate, Prudential, all met with me, as I was the manager there, about every other month on various research issues. So they were very helpful in making the research happen. It was as most people know, it was a questionnaire study. And as I recall, there were 3 forms of the questionnaire, which had to be distributed randomly. Now, I can't tell you how good I felt, because when you're telling an industrial psychologist to distribute randomly, they know what you mean. So I was sort of in good hands. I had 10 to 12 companies across the United States, all with industrial psychologists taking care of the questionnaire. So it was excellent support that I received. And then we didn't know the answer at the time. So yes, but of course, as we know now, it turned out, yes, in fact, now with the label of Think Manager, Think Male, yes, we found out that the managerial position is stereotyped and that it can be a psychological barrier to the advancement of women in management. It was it was the first study of its kind we called it sex role stereotyping, of its kind in the country. And what I recall, those of you who are doing research now will chuckle at this. I think for my 1973 study, I think I had 10 references of prior research. And one of the references I know was the statistics book I used. Now, of course, fortunately, we have just tons of research, but you do have to reference it if you're doing your research. Now, the second part of the question is the theoretical and practical implications. I'm just duly impressed myself in terms of theoretical. It seems to have inspired the absolutely wonderful work of Madeline Heilman and the equally wonderful work of Alice Eagley. Both of these research have gone on to do just amazing research based upon theories that were inspired by this research, but they have just done outstanding in terms of how they built on this particular idea. In terms of practical applications, and this was really more my bailiwick, I'm not a theoretician. When I did the research, I wanted to do it to bring about change. And this is really where I first began to develop the idea of research as an influence strategy. So in those days, I say we're in the 70s, there were no women anywhere in any senior positions. I knew that, excuse me, if I did, say, a seminar with executives, male executives, and started talking about, oh, we need more women, and here are some psychological barriers to their progress, I probably would have gotten a yawn and a lot of dawdling and a kind of, what does this young woman know? So I wouldn't, that's my feeling. But I didn't have to do that because I'd done the research. So here's what I did. I went with my data and said, now, I'm not saying this. This is what the data said. And the people who completed the questionnaires are men and women, just like you. They're middle managers, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to say, it got their attention. Then they could relate to what I was saying. So after, discussion of the research, what was cool was then we could move into, okay, now that we understand this a little bit, how can we make selection and promotion more objective so that stereotypes have less influence on these outcomes? But they were able to both listen, and then we could work together to try and come up with ways to minimize the effect, excuse me, of this gender stereotyping. So that was the beginning, and I never could have thought that it would still be referenced and going on now, but certainly gives me great delight that it was able to help bring about change in the advancement of women in management.
Definitely. And I think as an attestment to the influence, if we glance over the SIOP program, you will see a big theme right now is DEI. And I think a lot more attention is being paid to this topic. So thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, it really warms my heart.
So after you left industry to become an academic, what was your initial research focus?
Okay, so after I decide to leave industry, I really had a major focus and then a more specific one. And the major one, excuse me, was organizational change. Now, this was around 1975. And quite frankly, what's called OD, organization development, which dealt with change, wasn't really high on the list in industrial psychology world. They were, now they are, but I was, having watched the flex time intervention, which is a term we didn't quite use then, but watched that intervention and how it really, anecdotally seemed to improve the trust levels of the subordinates of the superiors, because lo and behold, when the bosses weren't there, the people actually did work. So I got interested in organizational change. So my first move into the academic world was Case Western Reserve, because they were the hotbed of OD. And I, as a mentor there, Frank Friedlander was an important influence. He was a Division 14 member who became a very prominent person in the area of OD and was also at Case. So while I went as a professor, I really went to learn all about OD. Specifically, though, now I have more time than I did in industry. I had a research topic. And what I did, or what came to my mind, was something that was very important to me while I was in industry, was how do you get things done? How do you use power and influence to implement the ideas that you think are good for a company or for the people, power and politics? So that's what I started studying. And I have to say, some of my academic colleagues kind of looked at me and said, well, I don't know, that's not anything we research. But for me, having seen its importance and its use in organizations, that's what I wanted to study. So I got involved with that. And then I went from case, excuse me, getting over colds. I went from case to invited to be a visiting professor at Yale when they started their new school of management. So that year, I designed for the first time a course in power and politics in organizations. And there were doctoral students and master's level students there. I do just briefly remember they kept carrying around, one of the books we read was Machiavelli, and they kept carrying it around. And I said, we're done with that book. Why do you keep using it? And they said, oh, because then it shows we're in your course and they think we have lots of power. So okay, I said, whatever works. But anyway, then I went from there to the Wharton School, and then I did an actual course on power and politics in organizations. And it was then the first course in a major business school on power and politics in organizations. And then I started using my Wharton students as help, started collecting more data on power strategies and power bases and so on. And one of the projects where I helped collect, where I got some of the data, was I said to each of the students, now your job is to go out and find the two most senior executives that you can find, excuse me, and interview them on power. Now, couldn't have asked for a better place. And Wharton students are extremely competitive. So they all were trying to outdo each other to see who could get the highest level people to be interviewed. And one story that I remember about that, they came back and told me that they had gone, I don't know the company, they'd gone to one company and they were sitting with a CEO, and there was the CEO and five of his people all in the room. And I think the CEO probably didn't know what the interview was, but he wanted to help Wharton students. So they all sat down, and as soon as he became aware, they told me that it was about how do you use power in organizations. They said he just hardly moving a muscle, turned his head, looked at the five subordinates, very gently just turned like that, nodded, and they said they just jumped up like puffets, ran out of the room, closed the door, and then the CEO said, and now we can talk about power. So that was their example of power in organizations. And just to finish that, so I did more research, did some in the UK as well, and then had a wonderful colleague, Larry Greiner, who was out at USC at the time, and he and I, kind of combining both my interest in change and power, he and I co-authored a book, Power and Organization Development.
Thank you. Those are very important topics, and I think those courses are still offered for most of the, for example, MBA classes. That's a must-take course on power, influence, even negotiation. So thank you for sharing that with us. So the next question is, what ignited your interest in studying and advocating for impoverished working women? What did you do? And just take us through the journey, please.
Okay, and it was a journey, let me tell you. So we're moving in now. I've been in academia for a while. We're moving into the 90s, and then I moved. I moved from New York to Gettysburg College, which was a move I really wanted to make. But so that was the upside. I did a lot for work family reasons, but I was happy to be there. But maybe I didn't think this through as much because I was in South Central Pennsylvania, a rural area, and there were no corporations, which is what I was used to dealing with. So I said, what am I going to do now? So it was all accidental, this stream of research. So what I first did, since great lover of organizations, I said, I know what I'll do. I will study nonprofits, because there's a lot of nonprofits around here. So I made appointments with a variety of executive directors and started asking them questions about structure and so on. What I didn't realize when I did this was that they were delighted, to have then my title, was professor of management. They were delighted to have a professor of management interested in their organization. And I found myself being invited to be a member of a variety of nonprofit boards. So two in particular, I was invited to be on the board of Survivors, Inc., which was a organization of domestic violence to help survivors of domestic violence. I was also invited to be on, I forgot the name now, but it was a board, an organization that funneled federal money to help low-income individuals get job training. So there I was. Now, while I'm involved with these boards, this is in the 90s, there was a big hoopla, anti-welfare discussions. And basically, it was saying, these lousy, no good welfare mothers, they don't want to work. They're just having babies for money. So that's what the news was reporting. But there I was with these two organizations seeing something entirely different. For example, when I was studying training, when I would go, one time I went and I noticed that there were women from the domestic violence shelter there. But when the course was over, they sort of snuck out the back door. So I said, why are they sneaking out the back door? And the leader said, well, they don't want their abuser to see that they're getting training, or they might be more victims of more violence. So I went, maybe there's a connection here. Second, and actually more important, I was getting with the second group, when the women, mainly single mothers, would get job training, like as nurses' aides and so on, they had graduation ceremonies when they would get their certificates, and the women would tell their stories. One example, I remember this woman, she had only got as far as the 8th grade. She had 3 elementary school children. She did go back. She got her GED, that'd be the high school certification. She was holding 1 or 2 part-time jobs while she was getting this job retraining. And I'm listening to her story and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I couldn't do this. She's amazing. So basically, I'm hearing the press saying all this negative stuff, and I'm meeting these women, and they're hardworking, a lot of struggle. So once again, I said, we need to do some research here. Now, for me, it was a different journey because, okay, when I was a manager and I was studying women in management, well, I knew all about that. I could jump right away to hypothesis testing. But now we got women in poverty. I grew up middle class. I didn't know much about that. And I tried to learn, and I said, I just can't come up with hypotheses. I think they will be stale and meaningless. I need to learn more. So that said, something I had never done before, I needed qualitative research, which was new for me. So I developed semi-structured interviews where I could learn and listen, and that's what I did. I went to each woman's home with 2 tape recorders. I sat at their kitchen table. Sometimes the kids were running around, and gathered through my semi-structured interviews their stories, because what I wanted to learn was I wanted to get the full picture of their lives. What were their lives like? What were the circumstances that brought them to poverty? What are some ways that we can get them out of poverty? But I wanted the full picture, not just the narrow, well, how do we get them off of welfare, but broadly, how do we help these women? So that was the focus of my research. That's what I did. And when I wrote the book, Voices of Mothers in Poverty, from the margins, I used their voices in the book. So it became based in their voices, their actual voices. And then what I did, I was asked, I did a lot of, right at the time in terms of change, I did a lot of op-eds that went in newspapers nationally, did a lot of radio talk shows. And again, research as an influence strategy. This was a different kind of research. And in these cases, and especially my public talks about it, I was able to present some of the stories and able to give both the general public and, more importantly to me, policymakers, what was it like to live in poverty? Because, limited experience, in hopes that that would really help them to understand the real issues and then bring about some change. That's the story of that journey.
Thank you. That's such an amazing story to use science to amplify the voice for people who wouldn't have a say in the press, in the media back in the
Mhm.
days, for sure. Um, Next question. What was your role? I guess this is related to the previous question. What was your role in the development of humanitarian work psychology? And what do you think IO psychologists can do to further enhance our work in this area?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm absolutely delighted with the growth of humanitarian work psychology. Sort of in brief, I think my contribution was that I had already done research in the area of poverty. I mean, one of the key figures, but the key figure, of course, in the development of humanitarian work psychology was Stu Carr, who really was the really force behind this whole movement. But the fact that I had research data, I think sort of enhanced the credibility of this very, very new field. And what comes to mind, and Walter Reichman put on, I believe, the first symposium at SIOP, and he had invited several of us, including Stu, I think Frank Landy, Michael Fraser, to talk about the kinds of research and ideas that we had for humanitarian psychology. One thing before I mention my research that I remember about the symposium was it was packed. And we kind of looked around at each other and said, I think we're onto something here. This was before it even had a name. But the research that I did there that I would talk about, I say, in addition to the work that I did in the United States, I then, I don't know, follow-up is the right term, but the next research that I did was women in developing countries, and specifically in Nicaragua. And I had initially gone to Nicaragua on a student trip, excuse me, taking students there. And then the research ideas came out of that, where I I was observing, and I said, most of these women are in work-related groups. They're all impoverished in this country. What's the role of work-related groups on their self-esteem, on how they live, et cetera? And again, to me, now it might seem a little odd, I viewed that as a work psychologist, an IO psychologist research kind of question. So I just went right back to my research training to ask this question. And I did research in Nicaragua, a procedure similar to the one I had developed for the women in poverty in the United States, which might sound a little odd because I don't speak Spanish. But I had 8 work-related groups. They were all different. I had a weaving group. I interviewed women in the sweatshops, which was quite a moving experience. I had sex workers and agricultural groups. So I went to each one of these groups individually, but I interviewed them in groups. And I view this project in a way as a demonstration project. I had translators. So they would ask the question, I would ask the question in English. They would ask it in Spanish. The women would answer in Spanish, and then the translator would translate it back to me in English. And if that sounds convoluted, it turned out not to be. After a while, we sort of got in a groove, and I really felt I was eyeball to eyeball with these women. So it's very similar kind of qualitative research. I had their voices, albeit as a group, but nonetheless tape recorded and stuff. So when the humanitarian work movement sort of started, I already had done the research, so I was able to help out, if you will, by being able to present that in various chapters and so on. And then it was after that symposium that Walter started that I couldn't make the meeting, but Stu said, let's all meet in London, and hence humanitarian work psychology was born. Now, the second part of the question, I think, was how IO can get involved. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just listening to my experiences, the answer is volunteer. If you are to get more experience to learn. Certainly for me, it was clear if I hadn't had those volunteer board experiences, I wouldn't have been exposed to these issues. And then because I was an IO psychologist, I was able to apply research techniques and answer questions that hopefully are helpful. But volunteer at food banks. The second reason for volunteering is they could use your experience. So what we bring to the party in terms of how we think about issues is very important to these nonprofits. So you can both learn, if you're interested in follow-up research, but at the same time, you can make a contribution to the very organizations to which you're volunteering.
Mhm. Yeah, that is excellent advice for a psychologist. So transitioning to the next question. So after you retired from Gettysburg College, what new paths did you follow?
Ah, yes. Well, I stopped teaching, but I didn't stop working. And I was very pleased. Two in particular that I followed. One, as soon as I retired, I got involved with the United Nations. So first, I was an NGO representative to the United Nations on behalf of the International Association of Applied Psychology. Did that for a while, and then I followed that up. I then became a NGO representative to the United Nations for the Society for Center for Socioeconomic Development that was based in Geneva. Now, as a representative, then you have access to the United Nations. And I just have to say this as an aside, nothing made me more proud than to wear that badge and sort of enter the inner sanctum of the United Nations and go, oh, I'm here. But that's an aside. So that gave me the opportunity to attend a variety of meetings and so on. And one of the most exciting meetings for me every year was called the Commission on the Status of Women. This is the largest gathering of people at the United Nations annually. And every year, approximately 8,000, mostly women, converge on the United Nations from all over the world. So nothing could, 2 weeks, sessions that start 8 a.m. in the morning and go to 8 p.m. at night, multiple sessions sort of make SIOP look not too active. I mean, it's like a quadruple SIOP all at once at the United Nations. So I was very proud to be a representative at these commission meetings. And then at least twice or three times, I don't remember, thanks to Lisa Sari, an IO SIOP member, she initiated symposia that I and other colleagues put on at the Commission of the Status of Women, bringing the work of IO psychology to other individuals here and internationally. So that was exciting. Lastly, at the United Nations, and I did some other talks at the United Nations, but what really made me feel most proud, I was invited in 2019 at the 12th Annual Psychology Day at the United Nations. And the theme of that Psychology Day was women, enhancing the status of women globally. And there were 4 invited speakers. I was one of them. And I have to say, I was very, very proud to be able to present my work, my ideas at the United Nations. So that whole, and I've stopped recently, but that has been a very important part of my life to be involved with the United Nations. And I know SIOP is very involved still with the United Nations, which I just think is terrific. The second sort of area that I did more work in was speaking internationally as an invited speaker on the topic called Women in Power, which was sort of an expansion of my work and other people's research that I put together. And it started at ICAP in 2014 in Paris when I gave this particular talk, which was very well attended, and people became very interested in the idea of women in power and how I could present it. And it just started the ball rolling in terms of invitations globally, the UK, in Turkey, in Poland, et cetera, on women in power. One in particular that stands out, it was great fun, thanks to Barbara Kozuznik in Poland. She initiated, I was the invited speaker to Women in Power in Poland. And just for me, it was fascinating. So I did my presentation with my PowerPoints, and now everyone was fluent in English, but just as a backup, there were my PowerPoints on the side, all in Polish. So it was very international. And in those experiences, it was also interesting for me to sort of look back and think, here we are. So these talks were mainly like 2014, 15, 17, 18, and so on, and think, wow, so much is going on internationally in terms of the enhancement of status of women in leadership positions. And I thought back to my work in 1972, when there was nothing. And while there was minimal in the United States, there was mostly zero around the rest of the world. So it sort of did my heart good to see how far we really, ways to go, but see how far we have come.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And related to what you just shared, starting from being a practitioner to ultimately amplifying our role at the United Nations. When you think back to your career, how did you manage your 50 years plus years of career by always staying curious and passionate?
Good question. I think when I think about the question, it's probably because of my sort of focus on asking the question based upon the experiences that I was having at the time. And so because the experiences tended to evolve and be different, the questions were different. So, as we recall, as I said earlier, when I was in industry and there were no women, that prompted the question that then I did research on. When I was a volunteer in terms of the area of poverty, that prompted a whole different kind of research question. Back when I was at MetLife in this, talk about bureaucracy, they would ring bells to tell people when to have their coffee hour. So there I was in this bureaucracy, and the question was, well, how can we expand the situation and loosen this bureaucratic system? Hence my research on flex time. So sort of follow the question, what's the question, based upon the experiences at the time, just always, kept me extremely interested. Basically, what's the answer? And I think the second sort of reason why I continue to enjoy what I do is my, clearly by now, as you can tell, sort of interest in research for change. That's why I like to do it. It's out of my own experiences that I sort of developed research as an influence strategy. Not everyone thinks of research that way. It obviously has wonderful other purposes, et cetera, but that's how I've always thought about it. Research for change, research as an influence strategy. How can we develop research to improve the lives of working people? And even based upon my research in poverty, I developed sort of a term that I've called social advocacy research. And this is definitely research for change. And as I said earlier, when I was doing the research on poverty and I was able to bring the voices of the women to policymakers, and as we say, sometimes statistics are essential, but sometimes the words of the women can move the heart. And if you move the heart, you may be more likely to inspire people to bring about change, to improve, in this case, the situation of an impoverished individual. So I think those two facets, what's the question? And then why am I asking it? Hopefully to bring about meaningful change have sort of been my reason for all of this. And I look back, one of the other good things, the questions, as I say, I've been able to work in a variety of arenas, always remaining an industrial organizational psychologist. And I sometimes say best career choice I ever made.
That's awesome. And related to this keyword of change, how do you think the landscape of IO psychology has evolved over the years?
In many different ways. I'm just going to list the three that sort of come out to me. One, and I have to bring it up again, is, we were talking about this earlier, think about the area of gender. Now, when I started out as an IO psychologist, I have the statistics, 3.88% of all the people were women. That's a pretty small number back in 1969. Now look where we are. It's truly fantastic progress. And I do remember when I was, say, 1972, still young and in industry, again, looking around, what are we going to wear to the cocktail party, shirts and ties? I decided to write an article which was published in the American Psychologist, called The Woman Industrial Psychologist, Illusion or Reality, because that was kind of true. We were sort of an illusion, but I wanted to write about it. And one thing that I recall, there was no email then or anything, but I got so many letters from women, and it was kind of the same story that back in the early 70s, they said, gee, I really wanted to be an industrial psychologist, but my professor said it wasn't for women, or my male professor, they were all males, except for Pat Smith, my male professor said it wasn't for me. So thank you so much for writing the article. I think that maybe kicked things off. And then, everybody did so much good stuff. And so now we have obviously gender equity within the field. Secondly, again, as I mentioned before, delighted to see this rise of both humanitarian work psychology and what SIOP is calling a pro-social. that I'm delighted to see the field expand its horizons. We have so much talent and expertise, vitally important for individuals working within organizations, but I always keep in mind that the mission of the APA is to promote the human welfare. So we have much expertise that we can bring to bear on individuals who work outside of the organization, social change related to work, and so on. And we're doing it. So that's been a wonderful change, that it is now acceptable. And once again, as you said, the themes at SIOP, I think humanitarian work psychology is also a theme, and that's just fabulous. And the third, which has been a change, it may not seem like that to some, is the increased sort of course, we're international. And this too was not, forms of communication have changed and I remember the fax machine have made it easier, but we've really evolved. We're now both with the International Association of Applied Psychology and just the whole idea, when we do research, we think internationally. The Alliance of Organizational Psychologists has just been a fabulous way for all of the international groups to get together. So that, I think, has been a third area that I see has changed since I started out.
Mm-hmm. So related to the three changes that you mentioned, what direction would you like to see IO psychology go in the future?
We're doing it, but I would like to see even more focus on policy, our role in affecting policy. Say we're doing it, but we can do more. I'd like to see it, say, the White House, the Department of Labor, or at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. Here's my view. I think that, whenever there's a focus on people who work, the role of work in wherever society and the government in this local, I would like to see it when there's a meeting on this, that we don't start the meeting until the IO psychologist shows up, that our expertise is essential to any decision-making about that. And I think that we will get to that point, because I want IO psychology to be the go-to field when it comes to issues of people at work. So that's where I'd like us to go, and we are going in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome to hear. So the next question, what advice would you offer to aspiring IO psychologists who are just beginning their careers, based on your own experiences gained throughout your academic and practitioner journey?
Well, I guess I would say, maybe it's been a theme again, also what I've been saying is follow that question. What are the questions that need answering? What questions that you see are meaningful? So that make a difference, and you have the ability to answer. But what are your questions based upon your experiences? So part of that is go out and get as much experience in as many different arenas as you can. But wherever you are, think about what is the question, what needs answering? And you will then have hopefully the most wonderful kind of journey. That it will be different, though. And that's what I think is, I'm almost curious. That's my question of today, which is, what are the questions that the younger people listening or who will listen to this, what are the questions that you find important? Because I'm not in the mainstream anymore. I've been there. You are the ones to answer the meaningful questions, because you are out there with the people who work. So that would be my own research. What are the important questions? But ask them. And as I say, best career choice I ever made. If you follow the question, ask what you believe is meaningful, that will make a difference in the lives of people who work, you will have an exciting journey in this field as well.
Thank you so much. It's such excellent advice. And I really hope, we call this series Living History Series, but I feel like we can just use this for Psych 101 to convince people to get into IO, because this is so incredible and amazing. So those are the questions that we have on the slides. Next, we have some time to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Virginia, you can type it into the box, the Q&A box. So check. And also, I know Milt is on the Zoom call. Milt, did you have a question you also want to ask?
What do you have, Milt?
Well, I'd like your comment on the hype about artificial intelligence and how that influences your quantitative teaching from Jacob Cohen and all of the industrial psychology you learned so many decades ago.
You know what, Milt? That's a question, and rightfully so, that I have to pass on. It's just not it's not what I have any experience in. It's not my time to have the experience in. I will save that for the next generation to answer that question.
Mhm. Yeah, and I
Okay,
think
well,
that
then the
sorry.
co-host, the host might take his cut at that. Zhenyu, what's your opinion?
I'm also curious, but this is also not my research area. And I think related to Virginia's comment, I think this is one of the things that we keep seeing in our field is just the constant change. And I think that will be one big question that we as a community will continue to have to explore and see how that would impact our research, our teaching, and our practice in the field.
I think that's it. Just keep your ear to the ground, and what's happening today, dive in and find the answer. And who knows, 50 years from now, what the new questions would be. I did want to say before we leave, and I know if there are more questions, I don't want to intrude, but I didn't get a chance earlier to thank SIOP for putting this on, thank the past chair and obviously Zhenyu, the current chair of the Living History Committee, for inviting me. It really has been an honor. I want to thank Milt Hockel. You would not know this, but when I couldn't do the SIOP on site, it was really Milt who was instrumental in making this Zoom happen. And the last thing, so thank you, Milt. The last thing I kind of need to say this, we talked earlier, or constantly, I guess a lot, about the very few women in the field. Certainly I mentioned Pat Smith. And I think of this living history and hopefully this, when it will be taped, younger people will see this and of the other IO psychologists. And I just needed to add this. I couldn't help but think of some people that we didn't get them in time to capture their thoughts. So I kind of want them to be involved in the two that I think of, who were my both friend and colleague during those early years in New York. The first is Mary Tenneper, who was the first woman to be president of Division 14. And the second, my also friend and colleague, Pat Dyer, who did outstanding work in selection at IBM. And they're no longer with us. And I just want to sort of have them be involved in my particular living history interview.
Yeah, thank you. We do have two questions from the audience. So the first question is from Laurie. So Virginia has been inspiring psychologists around the world for years, and today is no different, and I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you, Virginia. You're amazing. Do you have any thoughts on what IO psychology can do to have a greater influence on policy?
This is Lori asking the question.
Laurie, yeah.
Lori, you just do what you just keep doing what you're doing, and we will have more insights on policy. You have done phenomenal work in this arena. But I do think, as an easier answer is keep that in the forefront. Remember, it has not always been the bailiwick of IO psychology to be involved in policy. Early training, or those of us trained earlier, more of the textbook organizations. So I think just from a training point of view and from a thinking mainstream point of view, we have to constantly keep this in the forefront, that this is part of our job as well, not to be put on the side of things, but we have something to contribute, and that's what we need to do. The other, now this is just sort of coming to mind, but think about this. When I said volunteer, and I mentioned nonprofits and stuff, perhaps if more IO psychologists started volunteering in the political arena, they might have more of a toehold, a foothold in various, certainly local politics at the state level, where they would then be known and then be asked for their expertise at the right time. So that's back to volunteering. Just get out there and have as many experiences as you can.
Thank you. And the second question is from Anna. So what do you see as the most important question or two that new psychologists need to explore?
Which psychology? New ones?
New ones.
Again, and I feel really kind of fun about this. I'm not the one to answer that question. It is not my time, nor should it be. It's your time. And I mean this sincerely. You know what questions need. Don't look to me. I mean, I'd be happy to talk to you about it and so on. I don't mean that, but wherever you are, you know what needs to be answered. What are you curious about? What are you, back to my gender research, what are you angry about that you think needs changing? So maybe whatever moves not just your mind, but your heart as well. That is your question. And you, as an IO psychologist, have the talent and able to answer it. So you know the answer to that question better than I do.
Awesome. And that is such a great running thread throughout your career. And also it speaks to how we want to educate our science through what we do at SIOP. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Let me double check. All right. So I think that's the question that we have. And we're about time. So thank you again to everyone for attending this webinar. And also thank you so much to Virginia for sharing your time and your valuable lessons, experiences, amazing career with us. We're so happy to have you today.
Truly been my pleasure. It has been a delight to do this. Thank you so much.